There is an island off the Northumberland coast that becomes part of the mainland twice a day and disappears back into the sea twice a day. Lindisfarne, Holy Island, a tidal spit of dune and rock, 3 miles across, 9 miles south of the Scottish border. Accessible for a few hours, then cut off by the North Sea. Visited by pilgrims and Vikings, monks and soldiers, saints and publishing magnates. At one end, the ruins of a monastery that produced one of the most beautiful books in human history and was destroyed by the event that began the Viking Age. At the other end, a castle on a basalt crag that looks medieval but isn't. A Tudor fort transformed into an Edwardian fantasy, perched on a plug of rock above the grey North Sea. The island has been all of these things. It has been a holy place and a killing ground, a refuge and a target, a military installation and a holiday home. The tide takes it away and gives it back, and takes it away again. The story is stranger than the isolation suggests. Chapter 1. The Rock in the Sea and the Kingdom That Needed God. Prehistory to 635. The tidal island that would become Holy Island was not, in any straightforward sense, isolated before the tide made it so. The geology of the Northumberland coast creates a specific kind of ambiguity about what constitutes an island and what constitutes a peninsula. The low, sandy spit that connects Lindisfarne to the mainland at low tide is not a constructed causeway, but a natural feature, a bar of sand and rock left by geological processes that have been working on this coastline for thousands of years. When the tide retreats, the connection is open, dry land, navigable on foot or horseback, linking the island to the plain of Northumberland that runs south and west toward the Cheviot Hills. When the tide advances, the bar disappears under meters of cold gray water, and the island is suddenly itself, separated, independent, surrounded by the sea that Northumbrian fishermen have always worked. The natural ambiguity was precisely what made the place appropriate for the purpose to which it was eventually put, a community that needed the world to function, merchants arriving, pilgrims visiting, supplies delivered, correspondence received, but also needed the world to stay at a certain distance, could find at Lindisfarne the ideal arrangement: access when access was needed, isolation when isolation was required. The tide managed the border between the sacred and the secular with an impartial regularity that no human guard could match. Before the monastery, the island had been inhabited in the ways that coastal sites in northeastern England were inhabited for thousands of years. Archaeological evidence suggests prehistoric occupation, the kind of seasonal or permanent settlement that exploited the island's combination of grazing land, proximity to fishing grounds, and defensibility against mainland threats. The name Lindisfarne carries within it the Slavic and Old English elements that mark the presence of the early Germanic peoples who inhabited Northumbria from the 5th century onward. But the landscape had been shaped by human activity long before any Germanic settlers arrived. The Lough, an artificial lake in the center of the island, constructed sometime around the 7th century, may have been built by the early monks as a fish pond, but its creation involved the reshaping of the island's hydrology in ways that suggest considerable deliberate investment in managing the landscape. The political world into which Lindisfarne was drawn in the 7th century was one of startling volatility even by the standards of early medieval Britain. The Kingdom of Northumbria, the political entity that dominated northeastern England from roughly the late 6th century through the Viking disruptions of the 9th, was itself a recent creation, assembled from the merger of two older kingdoms, Deira, centered on the Roman city of York, and Bernicia, the northern portion whose heartland was the coastal plain around Bamburgh, the great rocky fortress 6 miles south of Lindisfarne on the Northumberland coast. The royal house of Bernicia had asserted dominance over Deira to create Northumbria, but the union was unstable, the dynasty fractious, and the succession disputed in ways that generated regular violence. King Oswald, who seized power in Northumbria in 634 after defeating and killing his rival Cadwallon of Gwynedd at the Battle of Heavenfield near Hadrian's Wall, was a man shaped by exile and by the specific form of Christianity that exile had brought him into contact with. During the years when his claim to Northumbria was suppressed and he lived as a political fugitive beyond the kingdom's borders, Oswald had been educated at the monastery of Iona, the island community off the west coast of Scotland that Columba had founded in 563, and that had become the primary center of what historians call Celtic Christianity, the tradition of the church that had developed in Ireland and the Irish-influenced communities of western Scotland in partial independence from the Roman practices spreading north from Canterbury. Celtic Christianity was not a heresy or a schism in any theologically meaningful sense. It differed from Roman practice primarily in matters of calendar calculation, how to determine the date of Easter, and clerical tonsure, how monks shaved their heads, disputes that seem trivial in retrospect, but which mattered intensely to people for whom religious uniformity was both a theological requirement and a political tool. More substantially, Celtic monasticism had developed a particular character, intensely ascetic, emphasizing personal holiness through prayer and physical discipline, organized around charismatic abbots rather than the episcopal hierarchy that Roman practice preferred, oriented toward missionary work that carried individual monks into remote and difficult places to spread the faith through personal example rather than institutional authority. When Oswald secured his kingdom in 634, he wanted his kingdom's Christianity reshaped in the image he had absorbed during his Iona years. He wrote to Iona requesting a bishop, someone who could organize the conversion of the Northumbrian population that had experienced Christianity in various forms but had never been systematically instructed in it. The first monk Iona sent was apparently not adequate to the task, described by Bede as harsh and inflexible. Unable to communicate the faith to an audience he found baffling, he returned to Iona, claiming Northumbria was impossible. The monk Aidan, who was present at the discussion in which this assessment was delivered, suggested a gentler approach. He was immediately designated the bishop and sent to Northumbria in his companion's place. Aidan arrived in 635. Oswald gave him the island of Lindisfarne as his episcopal seat, a choice whose logic was both practical and symbolic. Practically, the island was close to Bamberg, the royal power center, allowing Aidan ready access to the king and the court, where political influence was exercised. Symbolically, the island recalled Iona, a remote coastal site separated from the mainland by water, where a community of monks could pursue the ascetic life that Celtic tradition valued while remaining connected enough to the world to carry out their missionary responsibilities. The island was the right size for a community of modest ambitions, large enough to support the monastery's practical needs from its own resources, small enough that the scale remained comprehensible, the life intimate. The folklore that surrounded Lindisfarne from the earliest Christian period reflects the pre-Christian associations that any sacred site accumulates across its history. The eider ducks that breed on the Farne Islands, the cluster of small rocky islets a few miles off the coast from Lindisfarne, became known as St. Cuthbert's ducks, or Cuddy ducks in the local dialect, because of the later saint's legendary closeness to the natural world. But the bird's association with the holy man was itself a Christianization of older local beliefs about the sacredness of certain animals in coastal Northumbrian tradition. The otters that reportedly ministered to Cuthbert after his night of prayer in the sea, rubbing warmth back into his frozen limbs with their bodies. Encoded in Christian narrative, the ancient understanding that the relationship between human beings and the North Sea's creatures was one of mutual recognition rather than pure exploitation. The specific legend of the island's founding, preserved in Bede's Life of St. Cuthbert and in earlier texts, describes Aidan's selection of Lindisfarne in terms that emphasize both the practical calculation and something beyond calculation. The sense that the place had been waiting for exactly this purpose, that the tidal character of the island was itself a kind of theological statement about the relationship between the sacred and the secular. The tide as boundary, the crossing as pilgrimage, the isolation as spiritual condition rather than geographical accident. Oswald himself was killed in battle against the pagan king Penda of Mercia in 642, 7 years after Lindisfarne's founding. He was immediately venerated as a martyr, and his head was preserved as a relic that would eventually be interred with St. Cuthbert's remains. The two saints joined in death as they had been joined in life through the particular compact between Northumbrian royalty and Lindisfarne that had made the island's foundation possible. The dynasty continued after Oswald's death, sustaining the monastery's relationship to political power even as kings came and went with the violence characteristic of the age. What Oswald had created on the island would outlast him by centuries, would outlast the Viking age that his successors could not prevent, would outlast the Norman conquest that reorganized its institutional form, and would eventually outlast the Reformation that destroyed its physical buildings but could not erase what had been made there. Chapter 2. St. Cuthbert, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and the Paradise Before the Storm, 635 to 793. The monastery that Aidan founded at Lindisfarne in 635 became, in the century and a half that followed, one of the most important centers of Christian culture in Europe. Aidan himself established the essential character of the institution. He lived simply, in the manner of the Celtic tradition, close attention to personal prayer and asceticism, direct engagement with the people he was trying to convert, pastoral work conducted on foot through the Northumbrian countryside rather than from behind the authority of episcopal office. He learned the Northumbrian language. He walked among the people rather than riding above them. When King Oswald himself served as Aidan's interpreter, translating the Irish-speaking monk's words into the Anglo-Saxon vernacular for the Northumbrian nobles who came to hear him, the scene encoded something important about the early church at Lindisfarne. A partnership between ecclesiastical authority and royal power, each dependent on the other, each lending the other a legitimacy it could not generate alone. The missionary community that Aidan led from Lindisfarne pushed outward from the island into the whole of Northumbria and beyond. Monks trained at Lindisfarne carried the faith south into Mercia, establishing communities and building the institutional infrastructure of Christianity across the north of England. The monastery itself became a training ground for a generation of bishops, priests, and monks whose influence reached far beyond the physical boundaries of any single institution. From Lindisfarne, the church that Paulinus had brought from Rome to York in 625, and that had initially retreated southward after Oswald's predecessor Edwin was killed in 633, was rebuilt into something more durable and more distinctively northern. The great crisis of the early monastery came not from outside, but from within the tradition of the church itself. The Synod of Whitby in 664 convened to resolve the dispute between the Celtic and Roman methods of calculating Easter. Among other differences, ruled in favor of Roman practice. The king presiding over the debate, Oswy, delivered his verdict with a characteristic piece of political theology. St. Peter, he noted, held the keys of heaven, and it would be unwise to offend the man with the keys to the door you were hoping to enter. The Celtic party, led by Bishop Coleman of Lindisfarne, could not accept the ruling. They departed for Iona, taking with them the bones of Aidan and the traditions of the community he had founded. Those who remained at Lindisfarne faced the task of implementing Roman practice in a community built on Celtic foundations, a challenge that fell most directly to a monk named Cuthbert. Cuthbert is, after the island itself, the most important thing about Lindisfarne. He joined the monastery sometime in the 600s and 70s and was appointed prior, the second in command, responsible for the daily life of the community. The task of implementing Roman practice was enormous and deeply unwelcome to monks who had been formed in the Celtic tradition. And Bede records that Cuthbert faced sustained resistance, conducting chapter meetings that ran well into the night as monks argued, walked out, and returned to argue again. Cuthbert responded to this resistance with a patience that Bede presents as almost supernatural. The quality of a man whose relationship to conflict was so fundamentally different from ordinary human responses that it constituted a kind of miracle. He outlasted the resistance. He reformed the monastery. And the sustained internal conflict drove him progressively toward the solitary life that his temperament had always sought. Cuthbert's retreat to the hermitage on St. Cuthbert's Island, the tiny islet visible from the monastery at low tide, was the first stage of a withdrawal that eventually took him to the Innerfarne Islands, 2 miles out to sea from Bamberg, where he built a circular stone cell deep enough that he could see only the sky from within it. His intention was to see only God. The hermitage on Innerfarne became one of the most famous holy sites in northern England during his lifetime, attracting a stream of visitors who made the difficult sea crossing specifically to consult the man whom his contemporaries were already treating as a saint, in all but formal designation. The legend of the otters belongs to this period of Cuthbert's life. According to Bede's account, which he assembled from the testimony of witnesses who claim to have seen it, Cuthbert spent whole nights in prayer, standing in the cold North Sea water, singing psalms until dawn with the water up to his chest, the waves breaking around him in the darkness. When he came out in the dawn light, exhausted and barely able to move from the cold, 2 otters emerged from the sea and ministered to him, rubbing his feet and body with their fur, generating warmth through contact, attending to the man as he was unable to attend to himself. When he blessed them, they slipped back into the water and were gone. The story may be a piece of hagiographic invention designed to demonstrate Cuthbert's closeness to the natural world and his supernatural protection. It may also be a stylized account of something that actually happened. There are otters on the Northumberland coast. They are curious animals, and a man who regularly stood still in the sea at night might well have been approached by one. The line between natural event and miracle is precisely where Cuthbert's legend always lives. He was made Bishop of Lindisfarne in 684 against his wishes, after an extraordinary deputation that included the King of Northumbria himself, rowing out to Innerfarne to persuade him. Cuthbert served for 2 years, returning to the island in periods of episcopal activity and then retreating again to the Farne solitude that sustained him. By Christmas of 686, he felt death approaching and returned to Innerfarne for the last time. He died on March 20th, 687, having told the monks who attended his final illness to bury him on the island if they could, but to carry his bones away if the Vikings came. He was buried at Lindisfarne. 11 years later, when the monks opened his tomb to prepare his relics for a new shrine, they found his body incorrupt, perfectly preserved, without the decay that the years in a stone tomb would normally have produced. This discovery, which the medieval church interpreted as divine confirmation of sanctity, transformed Lindisfarne's relationship to the broader Christian world. The monastery that had been important as a missionary center and a training ground for the Northern Church became something additionally significant: the shrine of a saint, whose physical remains demonstrated in the most tangible possible terms that God had favored him. Pilgrims began arriving. Gifts of land and precious objects began accumulating. The monastery grew in wealth, in reputation, and in the visibility that wealth and reputation together generate. It was in this period of post-Cuthbert florescence, the decades between the opening of his tomb in 698 and the catastrophe of 793, that the most enduring material product of Lindisfarne was created. The Lindisfarne Gospels are, by almost any standard of assessment, among the most beautiful objects produced in medieval Europe. The monk Edfrith, who would become Bishop of Lindisfarne, began writing them sometime around 710 to 715, working in the scriptorium of the monastery with materials whose production required sacrificing approximately 150 calves for the vellum alone. The text was the four Gospels in the Latin Vulgate, written in a dense insular script that Eadfrith executed with a consistency and precision that modern calligraphers study as a technical achievement. But the text was only the beginning. The decoration, the carpet pages, the illuminated initial letters, the extraordinary full-page portraits of the evangelists, was something that belonged to no single tradition. The art of the Lindisfarne Gospels synthesized influences from the Celtic and Anglo-Saxon traditions with elements absorbed from the Mediterranean Christianity that the Roman Church had brought northward and that the monastery had access to through its connections with the wider church. The interlace patterns that fill the carpet pages drew on metalwork traditions in silver and bronze that went back centuries in northern Britain. The portrait pages reflected the icon tradition of Byzantine art, filtered through Italian manuscripts that reached Northumbria through the network of scholarly exchange that characterized the learned church of the 7th and 8th centuries. The whole thing was assembled, impossibly it seems to the modern eye, by a single monk working in the conditions of a Northumbrian island monastery in the early 8th century, with whatever light the windows admitted and whatever pigments the monastery's resources could supply. The binding was made by another monk, Ethelwald, the metalwork cover by a hermit named Bilfrith the Anchorite, who applied gold, silver, and precious stones in an intricate decorative scheme that no longer survives. The colophon added to the manuscript in the 10th century by Aldred, a priest of Chester-le-Street, names all three creators and states their purpose. Eadfrith wrote it for God and for Saint Cuthbert. The book was made as an act of devotion, intended to rest on the shrine of the saint in the monastery where it was created. It would not remain there long. Chapter 3. The First Terror and the Long Departure, 793 to 1093. On June 8, 793, the sky above Northumbria displayed signs that contemporaries recorded with the vocabulary of apocalypse. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the great running historical record of Anglo-Saxon England, compiled from earlier sources and extended year by year, recorded the events of that summer with an urgency that the chronicle's usual measured cadence never otherwise employed. Whirlwinds came, the chronicler wrote, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky, and great famine followed quickly on those signs of woe. And on the 6th day before the Ides of January in the same year, the ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne by rapine and slaughter. The dragons in the sky were almost certainly an aurora borealis, the northern lights, which in years of heightened solar activity can appear over Northumbria as curtains of fire and light. The whirlwinds and famine were the atmospheric disruptions of a year whose weather had been unusual across northern Europe. The heathen men, Norse raiders from across the North Sea, needed no supernatural explanation. They came in ships, early in the morning or in the gray light before dawn, and they hit the most famous sacred site in northern England without warning, in a raid that produced maximum return in minimum time and exploited the monastery's complete unpreparedness for anything of the kind. Alcuin of York, the most important scholar in northern England in the late 8th century and a major figure in the court of Charlemagne in Francia, wrote about the raid with the anguish of a man who understood its full significance. He addressed his letter to Higbald, the Bishop of Lindisfarne, who had survived. The church of Saint Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, shed the blood of saints around the altar, laid waste the house of our hope, and trampled the bodies of the saints like dung on the street. The language was the language of holy war violated, of sacred space invaded, of the cosmos momentarily inverted, the strong killing the helpless, the pagan destroying the consecrated. The practical consequences were brutal and specific. Monks were killed. Others were enslaved, taken back to Scandinavia as human cargo. The monasteries accumulated wealth, the gold and silver objects, the jewel-encrusted bindings, the precious metals accumulated through a century of royal and noble gift-giving, was looted. The buildings were damaged, but not destroyed. The stone structures of the monastery stood, the church stood, and in the aftermath, the surviving community worked to assess what remained and what could be rebuilt. The Lindisfarne Gospels survived, either hidden in time or not among the items that the raiders' speed and purpose made worth taking. The raid of 793 was not the end of Lindisfarne. What it was, what historians and contemporaries alike recognized it to be, was the beginning of something that would eventually mean the end of Lindisfarne as it had existed. The monastery was attacked again in 794 and again through the 800s, and the pattern that these attacks established, of Norse ships appearing on the North Sea horizon without warning, of a community that could not maintain the posture of sacred inviolability that a pilgrimage center required when it might be raided at any moment, slowly transformed the island from a place of flourishing to a place of sustained anxiety. Professor Joanna Story, professor of early medieval history at the University of Leicester and the author of the English Heritage Guide to Lindisfarne Priory, has described the 793 raid in terms that place its psychological impact above its material damage. The raid on Lindisfarne mattered to contemporaries less for what it destroyed, which was replaceable, than for what it demonstrated, which was that nowhere was safe. A monastery on an island in the North Sea, one of the holiest sites in England, the shrine of the most venerated saint in the north, had been attacked by men who did not recognize its sacred status and could not be deterred by that status. The conceptual world of 8th century Northumbrian Christianity included the assumption that holy places were protected, that God's favor would be expressed in the security of the places where God was honored. Lindisfarne in 793 showed that assumption to be false. The theological implications were enormous. The monks struggled with exactly this theological question in the aftermath. Why had God allowed this to happen? Alcuin offered the most developed contemporary answer, and it was in many ways the most disturbing possible. The raid was divine punishment. God had sent the pagans as an instrument of his anger at the sins of the Northumbrian people, their luxury, their unchastity, their abandonment of the discipline that the early church at Lindisfarne had exemplified. This interpretation had the advantage of preserving God's omnipotence while explaining the disaster, but it required the community that had suffered most directly to accept that their suffering was deserved. The logic was morally brutal even by the standards of medieval theology. The monastery continued for another 80 years after the first raid. The community maintained the shrines, performed the liturgical offices, preserved the manuscripts, and managed the estate that had accumulated around Cuthbert's cult. But the Viking raids increased in frequency and intensity through the 800s as Norse settlement patterns in Britain consolidated and raiding expeditions became more organized and better supplied. By 875, the cumulative pressure had become impossible to sustain. The monks made the decision that they had perhaps been postponing for decades. They left the island permanently, taking with them the things they could not abandon. The objects they carried in their departure in 875 define what the monastery valued most highly, and the list is revealing. They took St. Cuthbert's coffin, the saint himself, his relics, the wooden box that contained his bones, and the items buried with him. They took the head of St. Oswald, who had given Aden the island, and who had been killed in battle against the pagans decades before Cuthbert was born. They took the Lindisfarne Gospels, the book that Eadfrith had made for God and for the saint, which lived on the saint's shrine and was inseparable from his spiritual presence. They took what was sacred. The buildings, the estate, the rest, they left all of that. The wandering that followed lasted 7 years, with the community moving through Northumbria, carrying the saint on their shoulders. Cuthbert's coffin was not left unattended at any point during the wandering. Monks carried it by hand, moved it between resting places, protected it against the Norse, who were progressively occupying Northumbria and who would presumably have recognized the value of possessing Cuthbert's physical remains. The legend of the Gospels falling into the sea belongs to this wandering period, and it is among the most structurally perfect legends in Lindisfarne's mythology. According to the story, preserved in multiple medieval sources and given some physical support by the sea staining that modern analysis has detected on some pages of the Gospels, the monks, at some point during their wandering, attempted to cross to Ireland. A storm arose. In the violence of the storm, the Gospels fell overboard. The monks despaired. The saint's book, his most treasured possession, lost to the North Sea. Then Cuthbert appeared in a vision to a monk and told them exactly where the Gospels would be found, washed up on the shore. They looked in the place the vision indicated, and there the Gospels lay 3 days after their loss. The pages were stained with seawater. The text was intact. The Gospels were carried on. The physical evidence of seawater staining in the manuscript is real. The most credible explanation is mundane. Manuscripts stored in coastal conditions accumulate moisture damage, and the Gospels certainly spent time in exposed environments during the wandering. But the story that attached itself to the staining is not mundane. It is the most elegant possible expression of Cuthbert's protective power, the saint extending from his coffin to preserve the book made in his honor, ensuring that the object that represented everything the Lindisfarne community had produced during its golden century would survive to be carried on when everything else was left behind. The community eventually settled at Chester-le Street, where they stayed for more than a century before moving in 995 to Durham, where the saint himself indicated his willingness to rest permanently. According to the story, the cart carrying Cuthbert's coffin to its intended destination became impossible to move at Durham, immovable despite every human effort, until the monks accepted that this was where the saint had chosen to remain. Durham Cathedral grew around that decision, the greatest Norman cathedral in England, built to honor the saint whose cult had been generated on an island that was now empty of his bones and his monks alike. Holy Island was not entirely abandoned. A Christian community of some kind persisted through the Viking period, tending the church buildings and maintaining some form of religious life. But the monastery that had produced Cuthbert, and the Gospels, and the cult that shaped medieval Northumbria, that was gone to Durham. The island waited. Chapter 4. The Norman Restoration and the Border Fortress, 1093 to 1537. The return of monks to Lindisfarne after the Norman conquest was not a spontaneous recovery of the island's sacred character, but a deliberate act of institutional politics. William the Conqueror's subjugation of England after 1066 was accompanied by the harrying of the North in 1069 to 70, a campaign of deliberate devastation across Yorkshire and Northumbria intended to eliminate the capability for continued resistance to Norman rule. The harrying was thorough. Villages were destroyed, livestock slaughtered, food stores burned. The population of northern England, already weakened by Viking disruptions that had never fully healed, was reduced in some areas to near-extinction levels. Durham, which had become the center of the Cuthbert cult and the political heart of the region, was threatened enough that the monks briefly returned Cuthbert's coffin to Lindisfarne to keep it from Norman soldiers before bringing it back when the immediate danger passed. The Norman bishops who established control over Durham Cathedral after the conquest understood the political value of the Cuthbert cult and moved deliberately to appropriate it. The cult of an Anglo-Saxon saint was either a rallying point for English resistance to Norman rule or a mechanism for legitimizing Norman authority over the north. And the Norman Church chose the second option with characteristic efficiency. Bishop William of St. Calais, who rebuilt Durham Cathedral as one of the great achievements of Norman Romanesque architecture, gave the island of Lindisfarne to his new Benedictine monastery at Durham, enabling a permanent community of monks to be re-established there and asserting the continuity between Anglo-Saxon Lindisfarne and Norman Durham that gave the cathedral community its claim to be the legitimate inheritors of Cuthbert's legacy. By around 1122, a Durham monk named Edward was active on the island, and by 1172, the earliest surviving documents refer to a full-scale monastic community. The church that the Benedictine monks built, complete by around 1150, was a miniature version of Durham Cathedral itself, its Norman Romanesque arches echoing the great nave of the mother house on a dramatically reduced scale. The priory that emerged was never large. At its peak in the 13th century, it housed perhaps 10 monks with a prior. The monks were rotated from Durham, spending 2 or 3 years at Lindisfarne before returning to the mainland community. This rotation system kept the island from developing the independent institutional identity that a permanent community would have generated, but it also ensured that the island was always staffed by people whose attachment to it was temporary and whose loyalty was to Durham rather than to the place where they found themselves. The restored priory was never wealthy. Its modest endowment consisted of the island itself, its grazing land, its fisheries, the coastal resources that sustained a small community in the subsistence terms of medieval monastic economy. The fisheries were actually substantial. Cod, haddock, herring, salmon, and shellfish from the waters around the island and the Farne Islands provided the priory and the mother house at Durham with regular supplies. The lime kiln that the monks operated, burning limestone quarried from the island's north side, added a small industrial dimension to their economy. But the overall picture was of a modest cell of a great institution, maintained because of its symbolic and spiritual significance, rather than for any productive value it generated. Dr. David Rollison, emeritus professor at Durham University and a leading scholar of the cult of St. Cuthbert, has described the medieval priory's relationship to its mother house as fundamentally about legitimacy rather than economics. Durham Cathedral's claim to authority in the north rested on its claim to be the legitimate successor of Lindisfarne. That claim required Lindisfarne to be a functioning religious community. It would have been awkward to assert spiritual descent from a place that had been completely abandoned. The Benedictine priory was the institutional mechanism through which the connection was maintained. The monks who went to Lindisfarne knew they were participating in something symbolically crucial, even if practically modest. The 14th century border wars between England and Scotland transformed Lindisfarne's circumstances from modest to precarious. Edward I's invasion of Scotland in 1296, which initiated more than a century of open conflict, turned the border region in which Lindisfarne sat, 9 miles south of Scotland's contemporary boundary, into contested territory. Scottish raiding parties struck deep into Northumberland through the early decades of the 14th century. The priory's estates on the mainland, which provided much of its income, were repeatedly damaged by these raids, and the island itself was directly threatened. In 1327, the monks recorded that their mainland income had fallen to £21, compared with £127 in the years before the war. The community shrank. The poverty was real. The monks petitioned for the right to build defenses. The surviving 14th century walls around the prior's lodging, still visible in the ruins today, represent the physical response to this military reality. A monastery trying to protect itself with the kind of fortification that the border situation demanded, but that the monastic rules designed for peaceful communities had not anticipated. The petition to Richard II in 1385 to dismantle the fortifications, on the grounds that the monks could not afford to garrison them, reveals the impossible position of a small, poor religious community in a military frontier zone, too exposed to be undefended, too poor to mount adequate defense. The medieval period also accumulated Lindisfarne's most widely circulated supernatural legend, the Resurrection Cross, a large stone cross reputedly carved with scenes of the Last Judgment and kept in the monastery church. The cross, whose existence is attested by documentary sources rather than surviving physical evidence, was said to have healing properties. Pilgrims who touched it reported cures from specific ailments, following the pattern of relic veneration that medieval Christianity organized around the physical remains and associated objects of saints. But the legend went further than standard relic veneration. The cross was said to have moved of its own accord at moments of crisis, repositioning itself within the church to face threats from the sea, turning its carved face toward the direction from which Norse raiders or Scottish forces were approaching, as if the stone itself retained the protective instincts of the saint in whose honor the monastery had been built. Whether the cross actually moved, whether witnesses genuinely reported this, or whether the story was generated retrospectively to explain a standing cross whose position relative to the church architecture seemed anomalous, none of this can be determined from the surviving evidence. What the legend captures is the community's desire to believe that Cuthbert's protective power was still physically present on the island even after his bones were in Durham. The final crisis of the medieval priory came from Henry VIII's Reformation rather than from Viking or Scottish violence. The dissolution of the monasteries, the systematic destruction of the institutional church that Henry initiated in 1536 to appropriate the church's wealth and remove the authority structures that Rome had provided, reached Lindisfarne in 1537. The small Benedictine community was suppressed. The monks left for the last time to return to Durham, or to disperse into the secular world that the Reformation was creating. The building that they left behind was not immediately demolished, but repurposed. Henry's troops used the priory buildings as a naval storehouse, exploiting the island's convenient position for provisioning ships operating on the east coast. The ruins that visitors see today, the great Romanesque arch that has become the most photographed image of the priory, the truncated columns of the nave, the fragments of the prior's lodging wall, date from this period of conversion and subsequent neglect. The arch survived because it was structurally too massive to fall easily. The rest collapsed incrementally over the centuries that followed the Reformation, its stones eventually quarried for other purposes. The island itself was not empty after the monks left. A small lay community had always lived alongside the monastery, and the fishing economy of the island continued regardless of institutional upheaval. But the character of the place had changed irreversibly. The holy site was now a ruin. The castle was about to be built on the other end of the island, asserting a different kind of authority over the same tidal rock. Chapter 5. Henry's Fort and Elizabeth's Garrison, 1537 to 1603. Henry VIII dissolved the priory and then almost immediately decided the island needed to be defended. The logic was straightforward, if not particularly elegant in its timing. Lindisfarne's position, 9 miles from Scotland, fronting the North Sea, possessing one of the best natural harbors on the Northumberland coast, made it of obvious military value in the wars with Scotland that Henry was conducting and planning. The harbor that the priory's fishing boats had used for centuries could shelter naval vessels. The island provided a base for the troops that English military operations northward of the border required. In 1543, when Henry sent Edward Seymour, Lord Hertford, on a punitive expedition into Scotland that included an assault on Edinburgh, Lindisfarne served as the forward staging point. 2,000 men arrived on the island, organized their supplies, and departed northward. The island was not merely a religious relic, but an operational military asset. The fortification of the island developed in stages that reflected the iterative character of Tudor military planning. The first approach was minimal: earthen bulwarks protecting the harbor, essentially field fortifications that could be erected quickly, and that provided some protection for ships in the anchorage. These were followed by the establishment of a garrison with actual artillery. By December 1547, the fort's captain Ralph Clisby commanded a collection of guns that included a wheel-mounted demi-culverin, 2 brass sakers, a falcon, and another fixed demi-culverin. The names reflect the typology of Tudor artillery. A demi-culverin fired a ball of approximately 9 pounds. Sakers were lighter and faster firing, falcons lighter still. The garrison was equipped for the specific threats of the period: Scottish naval incursions, French assistance to Scotland, the general insecurity of a Protestant England surrounded by Catholic powers. The Beblowy Crag, the plug of basalt that rises at the island's eastern end, 30 meters above the surrounding flat, had been chosen as the site for the primary fortification. The reasons were visually self-evident. No other point on the island commanded the harbor and the approaches so completely. Whoever controlled Beblowy Crag controlled visibility over the whole of the island's eastern side and could bring artillery to bear on any ship attempting to enter or leave the harbor. The strategic logic that had made the island valuable as a monastic site, the visibility, the isolation, the natural defensibility, made the crag valuable as a military installation. The fort that emerged from the construction work of the 1540s, and that was substantially rebuilt in stone under Elizabeth I, was never, by any standard assessment, an impressive military work. Military engineer Sir Richard Lee, who inspected it in 1565, found only a decayed platform and a turf rampart. Evidence either that the original construction had been minimal or that the intervening years had been unkind to it. The Elizabethan works that followed in 1570 and 1571, costing £1,191, a substantial sum by the standards of provincial Elizabethan military expenditure, used stone from the ruined priory buildings as their primary material. The arch of the monastery that had stood for 4 centuries was quarried for gun platforms. The sacred was converted into the strategic. The building stones of the priory carry within them the history of what they were before they became fortification material. Medieval masons had cut these stones with tools designed for ecclesiastical construction, shaping them to the curves and angles of Romanesque arches and Gothic vaults. When Tudor military builders incorporated them into the walls of the Beblowy fort, the ecclesiastical profile of the stones was simply reoriented to military purposes. The conversion was pragmatic, not symbolic. There is no evidence that anyone at the time thought carefully about the theological implications of turning a dissolved monastery's fabric into a gun emplacement. But the physical reality of it persists. The stones of the castle that visitors climb today were cut for a different kind of building, and that earlier purpose is readable in their shape. The garrison life at the Lindisfarne fort through the later 16th century was characterized by the particular combination of tedium and anxiety that small outpost duty in marginal military installations generates. The union of the English and Scottish crowns in 1603 under James I would reduce the fort's strategic importance dramatically, but until that point, the garrison had genuine reason for vigilance. Scottish naval activity in the North Sea was occasional but real. The threat of foreign-sponsored interventions, French or Spanish ships carrying Catholic agents or troops to support domestic plots against the Protestant settlement, was not hypothetical in an era when the Armada of 1588 had demonstrated what Catholic powers were willing to attempt. The small number of men who made up the permanent garrison, rarely more than a dozen, often fewer, watched the sea and watched the border, maintained the guns, drew their pay when it came, and waited. The local folklore of this period has largely vanished, absorbed into the longer narrative of the monastic era or replaced by the clearer documented history of the military installation. One story persists, though its origins are uncertain. The legend of a garrison soldier who refused to leave his post when the garrison was withdrawn during a period of relative peace, remaining alone on the crag for months before his absence from the mainland was noticed and someone came to recall him. Whether this represents an actual historical event, a man so embedded in his duty that peace could not dislodge him, or a folk projection of the island's tendency to isolate those who came to it is impossible to determine. The story expresses something true about what service at the Bebloe fort must have felt like. The sensation of being stationed at the edge of the world, watching a sea that rarely produced the threat it was watched for, cut off from the mainland by tides that did not care about military urgency. James I's union of the English and Scottish crowns in 1603 removed the primary strategic rationale for the garrison. The border between England and Scotland that Lindisfarne had been positioned to watch was no longer a border between kingdoms at war. It was an internal administrative boundary within a single composite monarchy. The fort on Bebloe Crag continued to be garrisoned from Berwick upon Tweed, the nearest significant military installation on the mainland, and continued to protect the harbor. But its operational importance had shifted from frontier defense to coastal security, a rather different and considerably less urgent mission. The castle that Elizabeth had paid over £1,000 to build in stone began its slow drift toward obsolescence. Chapter 6: The Jacobite Adventure, the Sleeping Garrison, and the Decay, 1603 to 1900. The period between James I's succession and Edward Hudson's arrival at the castle in 1901 spans 3 centuries, during which Lindisfarne Castle experienced its moment of greatest and most comic military drama, followed by a long diminuendo into obsolescence. The greatest military drama involved 16 men, a brigantine called the Mary of the Tyne, a shave, and a pistol. The Jacobite Rising of 1715, the attempt to restore James Stuart, the Old Pretender, to the throne of Britain in place of the Hanoverian George I, was a serious political and military enterprise whose planning included securing strongpoints on the east coast of England, from which signals could be given to French and Spanish ships carrying reinforcement troops. Lindisfarne Castle, with its visibility over the North Sea and its proximity to Bamberg, where the Northumberland Jacobite Thomas Forster had his estates, was identified as exactly the kind of position that the uprising needed. On October 10, 1715, a brigantine called the Mary of the Tyne dropped anchor in the harbor below the castle. The master of the ship, Lancelot Errington, went ashore on an errand that seemed entirely innocent. He needed a shave. Samuel Philipson, the castle's master gunner, was also the garrison's barber, a doubling of functions characteristic of small military establishments where everyone performed multiple roles. Errington and Philipson knew each other, the request seemed ordinary, and Philipson invited him in. What Errington had established in the course of requesting his shave was that the full garrison was off duty. In the castle at that moment were Philipson, a soldier named Farguson, and Philipson's wife. 3 people, in a building that held the North Sea coastline's best visible gun position. Errington left, returned with his nephew, and claimed to have lost the key to his watch. This gave him a second opportunity inside the building. At that point, he pulled a pistol on Philipson and ejected all 3 occupants from the castle. The Jacobite occupation lasted exactly 2 days. News of the seizure reached the Berwick garrison almost immediately, and soldiers were dispatched to recover the installation. Faced with a force that substantially outnumbered the handful of men Errington had with him, the Jacobites surrendered. They were imprisoned in the castle they had briefly held, and then, in the episode that has delighted every subsequent historian who encountered it, they dug their way out, through the floor of one of the castle's lower rooms, into the rock below, emerging outside the walls, and hid for 9 days near Bamberg Castle before managing to escape to the continent. The episode is a footnote to the Jacobite Rising, which failed comprehensively across the whole of Britain in 1715. But it encapsulates perfectly the character of the Lindisfarne Castle garrison. Small, inattentive, easily surprised by men pretending to need a shave, not actually resistant when confronted with force, and, in the imprisonment phase, insufficiently secure to hold determined men. The fort that Elizabeth had built to protect the North Sea coast had become an installation where the principal threat was apparently not French invasion fleets, but barbers. After 1715, the castle settled into a decades-long routine of diminishing military relevance. The garrison continued from Berwick. The guns were maintained. The accounts were filed. Life on the island proceeded with the seasonal rhythms of fishing and farming that had characterized it since before the monastery was built, indifferent to the military installation that occupied the East End. By the early 19th century, the castle's military function had contracted to the point where it was essentially symbolic. A presence rather than a capability. Staffed because military installations are staffed, not because any serious strategic purpose remained to be served. In 1882, the castle received 3 new 64-pounder guns and was manned by members of the Volunteer Coast Artillery, the part-time civilian soldiers who provided coastal defense across the Victorian coastline. They left in 1893. After 1893, the castle was essentially abandoned to Coast Guard use, the occasional tourist, and the North Sea weather. The roof admitted water. The lower rooms were damp. The stairs that had not been maintained for years became treacherous. The building that had watched the border for more than 3 centuries was quietly falling apart on its basalt crag. The folklore of this later period reflects the diminishment. Where earlier centuries had produced stories of saints and Norse raiders and the miraculous preservation of sacred objects, the 19th century's contribution to Lindisfarne's supernatural tradition was modest and domestic. Stories of figures seen on the castle battlements at night, glimpsed from the village below in the flicker of passing lamplight, not threatening, not ominous, simply there, watching the sea in the manner of all the garrison soldiers who had watched this same sea for 3 centuries. The island had accumulated too much history by the 19th century for any single supernatural narrative to dominate. The presences were multiple and layered, the stones carrying the weight of too many centuries to be claimed by any one of them. Chapter 7. Edward Hudson's Dream and the Castle Remade, 1901 to present. On August 12, 1901, the architect Edwin Lutyens wrote to his wife Lady Emily with news of an extraordinary proposition from his patron and friend, Edward Hudson. Hudson, Lutyens reported, had offered for a castle on Holy Island, a real castle, and out of which he would have to turn if the country went to war. Lutyens added, beneath this news, 3 words that captured his reaction precisely. Too funny. The joke was partly about Hudson's physique and temperament, which were emphatically unmartial. A lugubrious, deeply shy man whose public presence combined a bushy mustache with the settled expression of a bloodhound. But it was also about the proposition itself, that a Victorian publishing magnate, founder of Country Life magazine, would take on a Tudor artillery fort on a tidal island 9 miles from Scotland and attempt to convert it into a holiday home suitable for entertaining the Prime Minister and the Prince of Wales. Hudson had visited Holy Island while on holiday in Northumberland, encountered the castle, and experienced the response that the place has generated in certain sensibilities throughout its history. An overwhelming conviction that this was exactly right. The basalt crag, the ruined fort, the gray North Sea light, the tide cutting the island off twice a day. None of this was practical or convenient. All of it was exactly what Hudson wanted. He took out a lease from the Crown in 1902 and commissioned his friend Lutyens to transform the fort into a house. Lutyens was 38 years old in 1903 already recognized as one of the leading domestic architects in England, whose work drew on the arts and crafts tradition's love of vernacular materials and the honest expression of construction, while applying a design intelligence that the arts and crafts movement, at its more pedestrian, had lacked. He had worked with Hudson on other projects, the Country Life offices in London, several country houses that the magazine had featured, and understood his patron's aesthetic, a passionate romanticism for the English past expressed through objects and spaces that felt genuinely connected to that past rather than merely theatrical in their historical references. What Lutyens found at Lindisfarne was a building that gave him almost nothing to work with in terms of conventional domestic architecture and everything to work with in terms of atmosphere. The Tudor fort had no grand rooms, no staircases designed for processional display, no reception spaces calibrated to the social requirements of Edwardian hospitality. What it had were the vaulted stone chambers that had served as ammunition stores and guard rooms, a gun battery at the top with panoramic views over the sea and the Northumbrian coast, and the particular quality of the basalt crag itself. The sense that the building was not sitting on the rock, but growing from it, organic, inevitable, as if the stone had crystallized into the form of a castle rather than being assembled from raw material by human hands. Lutyens worked with this quality rather than against it. He retained the existing Tudor vaults in the lower rooms, using them as the dining room, the kitchen, and what he called the ship room. The latter fitted with a model ship in honor of the maritime identity that the space's original purpose had given it. He created a long gallery on the upper level that recalled the galleries of Elizabethan and Jacobean great houses without reproducing any specific example. He designed the entrance, an unprotected cobbled ramp ascending the outside of the crag to a door fitted with a working portcullis, in a way that made the approach itself a physical experience of the castle's relationship to its site, the exposed slope emphasizing what Lutyens identified as the defining quality of the place, its refusal to compromise with comfort or convenience. The furnishings were largely Hudson's own, pieces moved from his previous houses, supplemented by items commissioned specifically for Lindisfarne. Lutyens designed details down to the door handles, ensuring that every element of the interior participated in the aesthetic whole he had constructed around Hudson's romantic sensibility and the castle's own historical character. The effect, which visitors and Hudson's guests experienced and described, was of a space that felt genuinely old while being entirely livable. The Tudor vaults and the ancient stone absorbed the arts and crafts furnishings and the Edwardian domestic technology without visible inconsistency, the centuries coexisting in the rooms without obvious anachronism. Gertrude Jekyll designed the walled garden between 1906 and 1912, working in a space that had previously served as the garrison's vegetable plot, 500 meters north of the castle at a distance that reflected the practical constraints of the fort's original layout. Jekyll's plan was for a summer flower garden, 8 varieties of sweet peas, deep crimson and delicate pink, organized to produce maximum color during the August weeks when Hudson and his guests would most likely be present. The garden was deliberately separated from the castle by enough distance that the walk to it constituted a small expedition. Not the kitchen garden of practical necessity, but the pleasure garden of deliberate cultivation, requiring effort to reach, rewarding arrival with a concentration of color against the gray stone walls that the North Sea light made almost shocking in its intensity. Hudson entertained at Lindisfarne with the particular combination of passionate generosity and practical thoughtlessness that his letter-writing friends described with affectionate exasperation. Prime Minister Asquith came, the Prince and Princess of Wales, the future George V and Queen Mary, visited in 1908 and found the cobbled ramp alarming and the tide's schedule anxious-making. The prince, reportedly, was worried about being stranded on a tidal island despite having served in the Royal Navy, where tides were presumably a professional acquaintance. The cellist Guilhermina Suggia visited frequently. A cello is left in the music room today in her memory, giving Hudson's holiday gatherings a musical dimension that the austere stone rooms accommodated with better grace than anyone might have expected. Hudson sold the castle in 1922, when the post-war world had changed his relationship to the romantic Edwardian fantasy he had built, to Oswald Toynbee Falk, a stockbroker, for £22,000. Falk sold it shortly afterward to Edward de Stine, a merchant banker. De Stine gave the castle to the National Trust in 1944, remaining as tenant until his death in 1965. His sister Gladys held the tenancy until her death in 1968. In 1944, the National Trust became the guardian of the full historical accumulation of the place. The Tudor fort, the Lutyens' interior, the Jekyll Garden, and the island's 14 centuries of recorded occupation, stretching back to Aidan's arrival in 635. The ghost that haunts contemporary accounts of Lindisfarne Castle is not a medieval monk or a Viking victim or a garrison soldier with a musket. It is something more diffuse and harder to name, the sense that the building itself carries within its stones a weight of accumulated experience that exceeds what any individual occupant contributed. The visitors who report unease in the lower rooms, the vaulted chambers where the Tudor fort's gunners stored their powder, are responding to something real, even if it is not supernatural. The particular quality of spaces that have been used for extreme purposes across centuries, that have been the last refuge and the forward position and the place of waiting, that have looked out at the same sea through the same narrow openings across hundreds of years and countless individual human experiences. The stone records nothing explicitly. It records everything implicitly. The National Trust restored the castle in the early 2000s to the condition it would have been in when Hudson entertained his Edwardian guests, with the addition of electricity that the original occupants had lacked. The Gertrude Jekyll Garden was restored between 2002 and 2006 using her original planting plan, now held in a collection at the University of California, Berkeley. A journey the garden plans have made that Jekyll herself could not have imagined. The lime kilns near the harbor, where a Dundee firm burned limestone from the island's North Quarry through the second half of the 19th century, remain as industrial monuments alongside the religious and military ones. The tide cuts the island off twice a day and gives it back twice a day. The causeway that carries modern vehicles across the bar has existed in its current form only since the 20th century. For the 14 centuries before that, crossing to the island meant timing the tides, watching the sand, and accepting that the place you were going to would be your place until the sea permitted your departure. This constraint shaped everything about what happened on the island: the monastery's character, the garrison's psychology, the castle's atmosphere. The isolation that the tide imposes is not dramatic on any given day. It is simply the condition under which things happen at Lindisfarne, the basic fact that precedes every other fact. The eider ducks that breed on the Farne Islands still return to the shores near the castle in nesting season. Cuthbert's ducks, the Northumbrian people called them, connecting the birds to the saint who had stood in the sea with them in the dark and been attended by the otters in the dawn. The saint's bones are in Durham Cathedral, his Gospels in the British Library. His island is administered by the National Trust and English Heritage, and it receives hundreds of thousands of visitors a year who come across the causeway when the tide permits to see the priory ruins and the castle and the grey North Sea light that has been the constant across all the centuries.